Now, President Trump will soon be addressing the United Nations General Assembly here in New York. He's expected to tout his America First agenda in front of the world leaders.
President Trump will also likely slam Iran and defend his decision to withdraw from the 2015 nuclear deal. He's also expected to highlight his diplomatic success with North Korea. For more on this, let's bring in CBSN contributor Alex Kliment. He writes for Signal, a newsletter produced by GZERO Media. Good to see you.
Likewise.
So how will President Trump's speech and rhetoric at the UN impact the tensions between the United States and Iran?
Well, the U.S.-Iran drama is one of the big things that we're looking at the UN General Assembly this week. Trump, as you say, pulled out of the Iran deal, in the 2015 Iran deal earlier this year, because he said it didn't do enough to stop Iranian weapons programs and crimp Iran's regional ambitions. He's going to be at the podium and chairing the UN Security Council meeting tomorrow in order to get the other signatories to the deal to agree with the U.S. position that they should force Iran to renegotiate, to agree to a tougher deal. The other signatories are going to be saying, you know, we're not so into that idea, given that the existing deal was working perfectly well, and the Iranians certainly have no incentive to come back to the table. The Iranians are going to be trying to get the other signatories to stay in the deal, but the real ball game for the Iranians is to get help for their economy, because the U.S. sanctions that have gone back into effect and the ones that are coming on the Iranian oil sector later this fall have already severely damaged the Iranian economy. So the Iranians are looking for political support for the deal to stay in it, but also economic help for an economy that's approaching crisis.
So what's the strategy for the president to woo or win over the other allies that seem, you know, firmly committed to this deal?
Well, the fact that the U.S. is the 400-pound gorilla in the room when it comes to sanctions. I mean, the European companies have already left Iran, despite the fact that Brussels is talking about creating an alternative payment system to get around U.S. sanctions. European companies are not going to trust their fate to that. So the leverage that Trump really has is, look, the U.S. can put a stop to this entire thing with the financial sanctions and pressure the Iranians to the table. Whether other countries will buy that, whether the Iranians will cave, is a big question. I don't think they will. One interesting detail, though, is that the worse the economic crisis gets within Iran, the more it empowers hardliners within Iran who never wanted a deal in the first place. Right? They always said this is a bad idea for them. A nuclear deterrent is vastly more valuable than any economic benefits of opening to the West. And every time the real gets lower and lower and the oil exports decline more and more, they can say, this deal isn't really doing what it should for us, maybe we should leave. So there's a chance the Iranians themselves back out of the deal at some point next year.
Well, so you may know this. The president tweeted this morning, despite requests, I have no plans to meet Iranian President Hassan Rouhani. Maybe someday in the future. I'm sure he is an absolutely lovely man. Meanwhile, on Sunday, Nikki Haley in an interview said the Iranian president hasn't asked to meet. So I don't know who the president is referencing when he says requests have come in. But
did he say request? He says that he's requested it.
Well, he said despite requests, I have no plans to meet Iranian president. Whose request is the question. So, I mean, is that ever going to happen? I mean, the president has made inroads with North Korea. You know, 4 or 5 years ago, it was unthinkable that a U.S. president would sit in front of a North Korean dictator. Under terms agreed to by both parties. Perhaps the president can see some light here.
I think it's very unlikely, because in the North Korean case, Kim Jong-un was willing to open up to meeting with the U.S. president because he knew he had a huge bargaining chip to bring to that table, which is a developed nuclear program. The Iranians do not have that. Also, we have to bear in mind that antagonism towards the U.S. and the kind of tension with the U.S. and pushing back against the U.S. is a core feature of the Iranian regime, right? Anti-Americanism is core to the Iranian regime. So it's very unlikely you could see these two guys meet. Also, Supreme Leader Khamenei earlier this summer said there's no circumstance under which these two men will meet, and he, of course, calls the shots, particularly in foreign policy in Iran. So it's very unlikely.
And we've talked about this before. Kim Jong-un calls all of the shots all the time.
All the time,
he doesn't have to sort of...
there's no committee, there's no religious committee.
Exactly. Right. So if he says yes, it's a go. So the president's also going to be talking to the General Assembly. You know, he has in sort of the past talked about whether or not the United Nations is even relevant in this time. He's sort of backed away from that a little bit. But what do you expect sort of the push will be for his speech?
Well, I mean, his call will be to make the UN more amenable to U.S. interests. The U.S. has already cut back on some of its funding to the organization, saying, you know, not without some reason, that there's some inefficiencies in the organization. I think it's important to bear in mind what the UN does do and what it does not, right? If you were to just look at the UN Security Council, right, it is a theater of obstruction, right? Everybody is constantly vetoing each other's resolutions. The ones that are passed are weakly enforced or openly flouted. Yeah. Aside from the political aspects of the UN, there are also the UN agencies, the World Food Program, UNICEF,
right.
The UN Refugee. These agencies do a tremendous amount of invaluable work, right? The World Food Program fed 80 million people last year. The UN High Commission on Refugees helped 60 million refugees in 130 countries last year. And one of the big challenges for the UN at the moment is that those agencies are actually underfunded and running out of money, right? Secretary General Antonio Guterres earlier this summer was warning that there is a budget shortfall of something like $200 million to fund the work of those agencies. So underneath all of the kind of political bluster and kind of big headlines around the Security Council, there is also this good work that thousands of men and women do for the UN agencies that is work that individual countries either cannot or will not do themselves. And the underfunding of that is a big story. Trump will, to weave this back to Trump, Trump will be talking about what conditions he would attach to U.S. Funding, increasing its funding, or not cutting its funding for the UN.
It's interesting.